Hey guys, hope y'all are doing well. I'm going to go ahead and give y'all another video lecture. This time we're going to talk about westward expansion in the Plains Wars. Okay? Y'all have probably talked about some of this before in some of your earlier history classes, so some of it might seem like you've some old information, but I'm just going to try and explain it again, just so you know. Like always, if you're taking notes along with this video, just pause the video before I change the slide if I'm going too fast for you. Okay, let's get started. Right, so let's talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. As the name would suggest, it is the railroad that goes across the continent. The trans meaning across, continental meaning the continent, the across the continent railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad had been in talks for quite a while, starting in about the late 1840s, but the act finally got passed in 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act. It gave loans and land to railroad companies to encourage expansion of the railroads to the west. After the acquisition of California in the Mexican-American War, we needed an efficient way to get out there. For those of you that have played the game The Oregon Trail, you know that getting to the west is kind of hard, especially during the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. Okay? The Central Pacific Railroad began in Sacramento, California, and the Union Pacific Railroad began in Omaha, Nebraska. All right, this picture here is from the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay? It took them about 7 years to get it done. It connected the east and west by rail. It made travel safer and faster. Like I said earlier before this, it's really hard to get to the west, especially going through the Rocky Mountains. There was no good way to get across the Rocky Mountains before this, and it made travel much longer and much more dangerous. All right? Because of the Transcontinental Railroad, more towns could open up along the railroad, and it led to westward expansion. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, it would take months to get from, let's say, St. Louis to San Francisco. That would take a long time. Now you could travel coast to coast in just 10 days. You could go from Baltimore to Sacramento in just 10 days. The cost was about $40. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, but if you translate that into modern currency, that's about $1,200. Okay? And like this says, it is more than 1 month's pay for most workers. But it would cost more than that just to have the supplies to get from east to west in a horse and buggy. So it was awesome for everybody. The trains had indoor toilets and they had heaters, so it made travel very comfortable. And for just $75, you could get a padded seat. So about $1,200 just to go. And then if you got another $2,000 sitting around, you can have a pad on your seat instead of just a hard wooden bench. Okay. Going to the next slide. The majority of the workers for the railroad were Chinese immigrants. I haven't really talked to y'all about immigrants yet, but I will include a video lecture on immigration before we review Domain 3. All right, just know that there were a lot of Chinese immigrants in the West. It was easier for them to cross the Pacific Ocean and immigrate to California. Okay? They were treated harshly, paid very little, and many of them were injured or killed clearing the land for the railroads. They used a lot of dynamite to clear the Rocky Mountains, and this caused rock slides and avalanches, which caused the deaths of a lot of Chinese immigrant workers. Okay? Because the Chinese people would take the jobs for less pay than white workers, it created anti-Asian sentiment, or people being racist towards Asian people, especially on the West Coast. All right, let's talk about how westward expansion affected the Native Americans. Remember from Domain 2 when we talked about how Andrew Jackson said that the Native Americans would get Oklahoma and the land would be theirs forever. Okay? There were plenty of Native American populations here in the western United States, including the Sioux and Plains Indians. All right? White settlement of these lands forced them to be removed once again. Okay? So they were placed on reservations. Here's a modern map of federal lands and Indian reservations now. Okay? By 1862, 500,000 people moved west after the passage of the Homestead Act. Most of them were crop farmers, and most of the land was only good for cattle ranching, so they couldn't really plant anything. And for those of you who know anything about cows, they require a lot of land. Okay. They tried to adapt by creating new machinery, plows, threshers, which changed the land. This hurt the Native Americans because this land had been their home for a while, and they were mostly concerned with tracking the migration of bison or buffalo. But ranching was more profitable than crop farming. They could now use the railroads to ship the cattle back east once the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Before that, they had to move the cattle across the prairie on long drives. This is what cowboys did. They got cows across the land to the East Coast so that they could be slaughtered and used for meat. Now you could just ship them back on cattle cars on railroads, which was much more efficient and much more cheap. Let's talk about barbed wire for a second. Now, barbed wire was used to contain herds, but it also hurt the Native Americans. Most of the tribes were nomadic, meaning they moved from place to place following the buffalo. The barbed wire broke up the prairie and ended the Indians' way of life. Okay? Buffalo were hunted almost to extinction. Their migration patterns were disturbed by the barbed wire, and the Native Americans lost a lot of their tradition and lifestyle. Okay, let's talk about their resistance to the western expansion of the United States. So, Native resistance. By 1876, most of the Sioux Indians, that's how you pronounce this word, Sioux Indians, had been forced onto reservations. This guy right here, Sitting Bull, was the resistance leader. He fled to Canada to gain a following and make a plan to resist white settlement. In 1885, Sitting Bull was forced to surrender and moved to a reservation to keep his people from starving. The ghost dance. This is something that they did to scare the white people. An Indian prophet said that doing the dance would make whites disappear, and it would make the buffalo return. The U.S. Army took this probably more seriously than they should, and they banned the dance and set out to arrest Sitting Bull for encouraging it. We know now that a simple dance cannot make people disappear and cannot make buffalo return. But people were very superstitious in the 1800s, and they banned it. Sitting Bull was killed as a result of trying to encourage it. His bodyguard tried to prevent his arrest, and he was killed in a shoot-off. So let's talk about the Wounded Knee Massacre. This was the last major conflict in the Plains Indian Wars, and it took place at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. Okay. Sitting Bull's followers had fled their reservation to join Chief Bigfoot's tribe. The U.S. government said they needed to stay on the reservations. They sent the U.S. Army to South Dakota in 1890, and they killed nearly 300 Indians after trying to arrest Bigfoot. Most of them were unarmed, and their bodies were left unburied. This is just another in the long list of atrocities committed against the Native Americans in our country's history. Okay. This ended Native resistance in the Great Plains. The Native Americans had little power to fight back, and most of their leaders had been arrested or killed. The Native Americans then resolved to just stay on their reservations. All right, and that's going to be it for today. Stay tuned for another video on Wednesday. I'll be talking about American imperialism, so look forward to that.